Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear and see me okay today. If you've not heard or spoke to me before, my name is Hannah Wheater. I'm a digital marketing executive at My HR Toolkit, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. For those of you who are new to us, My HR Toolkit is a HR software provider for SMEs, and we're running an ongoing program of webinars covering a variety of business topics. So today we're looking at the Great Resignation, something that we've all heard about in the news recently, people quitting their jobs. And today we're going to be looking at how small businesses should respond to the Great Resignation. So this will touch on the factors that may be spurring into the Great Resignation, how small businesses can respond, how hybrid working strategies can help retain employees, and tips to turn the Great Resignation into the Great Retention. So following the presentation today, which should last around 30 minutes, we'll have time to answer any questions that you may have. So if you do just want to wiggle your mouse, you'll be able to see on the bottom of your Zoom bar a Q&A box. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation today, please do put your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat, just so I'll be able to see them clearly and answer your questions at the end of the webinar. So we also have the Zoom chat. So if you do have anything you want to contribute throughout, if you think that's a great point, or you want to use it for networking, that's absolutely fine. Please do get involved in the chat. We do encourage it. And a note to everyone today, it is just a session offering general advice, not legal advice today. So to get started, I'm really happy to introduce Gemma Dale. So she will be touching on the Great Resignation herself. And Gemma has worked many years working in HR. She's come across a variety of topics and works with small businesses. She's a published author on a variety of HR and business topics, and she's now a lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. So please do welcome me in welcoming Gemma today.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Hannah, for the very kind introduction and inviting me to come and talk today about this topic. And as I said, I'm going to look at a couple of different things. I'm going to talk about what is the Great Resignation? Is it real? And if it is, what do we do about it? But I think we're going to start with a poll just before we get into my slides. So Hannah, if I could have the poll. We just wanted to check in with the audience today and find out, are you actually experiencing a Great Resignation? Are you seeing more than normal turnover? So you should be able to see a quick poll now. So if you could give us a little vote as to whether you are experiencing more than normal turnover. Of course, assuming that you do measure it, and we'll just give you a moment to vote, and when everybody's had a chance to click, we'll see what the collective experience is here today, and then we'll get into the body of the presentation. How are we doing, Hannah, with those votes coming in?
Yeah, brilliant. I think if you have got anyone, if you do just want to submit your results, that would be great. That's great. I'll end the poll now and I'll publish the results to share with you. There we go.
Okay, so a bit of a mixed bag by the look of it then. So about half of people saying they are experiencing some more turnover. Well, for those of you who aren't, congratulations, maybe you're doing something right, and hopefully I can provide you with a few tips to just help you continue to go well with your retention strategies. Just bear with me a second now. I'm just going to share my slides, which hopefully you can see coming up on the screen now. Hannah, can you just give me a quick thumbs up and let me know if you can see the slides okay?
Yeah,
brilliant.
It looks great.
Thanks very much. Okay, so let's get into the subject today then. What is the Great Resignation? Well, it was a prediction initially that was made by an academic called Anthony Klotz at a university over in Texas. And he made a prediction in 2020 that a lot of people would leave their jobs after COVID-19. And it does look like he was onto something, at least to some extent. And then we just wanted to really start now with the data and see, actually, is it a real thing? Well, we haven't got as much data on this at the moment in the UK as we have in the US. But looking at the data where it is available, so over in the US, there are record levels of people changing jobs. So to get underneath that a little bit more, about 4.5 million people left their jobs in November. That was the last data that we had, and that was the highest recorded amount of people leaving their organisations in about 2 decades. But it's up, but it's not astonishingly up. So if we compare that data with the end of 2019, which was sort of the last, if I can use the word, normal period, it's up from about 20% to about 28%. So it's high. And we'll perhaps have a look in a moment as to why it might be higher than normal. But I'd say it's not maybe terrifyingly high, if I can use that language. In the UK, we're using data from the Office of National Statistics, and they're saying about 4% reported staff turnover had increased when we look at all businesses. So not huge, but it does look like smaller businesses having a slightly increased turnover. But like with all of these things, the sort of headline data hides a range of different factors. So if we look at who is leaving, particularly that US data, it is largely people from sort of food services and accommodation, so hotels, etc. That's where the majority of that turnover is coming from. And we can see other factors at play as well. So if we look at some research from McKinsey, they have found that parents, working parents, are more likely to leave their jobs at the moment than non-parents. And they predict a few different reasons for that. So all those competing pressures that have existed around working from home and juggling childcare responsibilities while sort of schools were closed, while childcare has, perhaps not returned to its pre-pandemic levels. So there's also some stuff in there about people reevaluating work-life balance, which I'll come on to in a moment. What I think is quite interesting is the number of people who are saying they might move. And of course, what people say they might do and what they will actually do can, of course, be two different things. Those jobs have to be there for them to move into in the first place. But Microsoft said about 40% of people globally considering leaving their employer over the course of the next year. And there was a survey a couple of months ago in the UK by Randstad, and they found that 69% of people were confident about moving to a new job, and that's 6 times higher than the average when they've run those surveys before. So something is definitely afoot. Will these intentions turn into a reality, I think, does remain a bit to be seen, and we'll know more about that in the months to come. But what might be sort of behind some of this increased turnover, or this increased sort of turnover intention, if I can describe it as that? Well, there is always turnover, and the pandemic may have had some impact on natural turnover. So people who would normally have left their job maybe during 2020 or 2021, but they've decided to stay put, maybe because of the general uncertainty of living and working through a global pandemic. Maybe they were on furlough, so they might have left their job, but obviously weren't going to do so while they were receiving a furlough payment. So what that's meant is some turnover that would have happened anyway is being pushed out, and we're seeing that now when we would otherwise have seen it over the last 2 years. We do know that some of the potential cause is around increased demand for flexible and remote work. So you've all seen the surveys. I don't think I need to say much more about that. That there's been a huge demand for increased flexible working, and I'm just going to skip ahead of my slides for a moment. And just show you a few of the headlines that I grabbed with a very, very quick Google search from a whole range of different publications. And there's different surveys on this showing different levels of intention, but there's certainly something around people saying, if I can't work flexibly, if my current employer will not support me to have hybrid work or some element of remote, then I'm definitely going to be looking for a new opportunity. I'm just going to go back to my previous slide. So what else might be going on? Well, there is the possibility that some people will not have felt that were treated particularly well during the pandemic by their employer. And I know that I've certainly been contacted by people on Twitter and on LinkedIn who've had some really difficult experiences of being pushed back to offices, perhaps when they were vulnerable, employers who weren't supportive of working parents. So again, we may have seen some people who became quite disengaged with our organisation during the pandemic and are now looking for work again. And I think it's quite possible as well that we will have seen some of this also playing out in those sectors that were particularly impacted by the pandemic itself. So maybe people in caring professions who have decided to leave those professions because of things like burnout. The other thing that's quite interesting, and I think this we'll come back to this later when we get to the what do we do about some of these challenges, is this idea of weakened ties. And there has been some research that was actually undertaken within Microsoft around the extent to which our kind of bonds, our social bonds with colleagues has been influenced negatively during the pandemic. So what the early research seems to suggest is those people that we work really closely with, our very immediate teams, we've stayed fairly tight with those people, we've retained those bonds. Those people that you saw occasionally, those people that you bumped into in the kitchen in the morning when you were making a coffee, a lot of that has sort of weakened and lessened. So, you know, when you look at why do people work in particular organisations, when you look at employee surveys, you always see this, you know, I like the people I work with sort of conversation. And, you know, our sense of belonging at work is really linked to our social networks. And those have, of course, been disrupted during the pandemic. So that also may be an influence. And then we've got this thing which I'm going to look at in a little bit more depth in a couple of slides' time, this idea of people really rethinking work and rethinking their life and the kind of work that they want to do as a result of the pandemic. So I'll come back to that in a moment or two. So let's have a look at outside of the pandemic and the current situation. Why do people leave jobs? Well, you know, this is a very unique thing. There are a really big range of reasons, and I've just got a few of them on this slide here that I wanted to touch on today. You know, at its most simple, people stay when they are happy and satisfied with their job and committed to their organisations, and they leave when they're not. But there are a whole load of layers of complexity under that really simple statement. So some of it will be pay and benefits. Now, we know from research, again, that actually it's not all about money for lots of people. There are lots of other reasons why they might choose to work in particular organisations or do particular jobs, but it still matters. And we are facing a cost of living crisis at the moment. We all know that the inflation's going up, energy bills are going up, food bills are going up. So some people will be driven by the desire or need to earn more money, or they may be dissatisfied with their pay. They may feel underpaid and as a result undervalued. So it does always come up in those sort of, you know, reasons why people leave. But people will also leave if they can't develop as individuals. And again, when we look at why do people stay within organisations, and we look at what motivates people, and I'm drawing on a brilliant book here called Drive by Dan Pink, which is a recommendation if you haven't read it, where actually we know that sort of this desire to be good at our jobs, mastery, as Dan Pink calls it, is really important. And if we feel we're not developing, that can also drive us to look for work. Now, the manager relationship, it's a bit of a cliche, I'm sure you've heard it, this idea that, you know, people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. But actually, like with lots of cliches, there's quite a good element of truth in there. And Gallup, employee engagement specialists globally, they did some research and they found that out of 1 million workers, you know, the number one reason why people might quit their jobs is having a bad boss. And apparently, again, according to their research in employee engagement, about 70% of the variance in people's employee engagement scores is down to that manager relationship. So if you've got not great managers, that will inevitably flow into your staff turnover. Work-life balance, again, it's linked to this other point that I want to come back to in a little while about people rethinking some of this idea about work-life balance after the pandemic. So I'll come back to that in a little while. Organisational culture, and again, big subject, and we can have a good old debate about what do we mean by culture. But generally speaking, if people feel that they work in a good culture, then that will help them stay. If they work in a bad culture, according to MIT, a bad working culture is 10 times more powerful than pay when predicting turnover. And that's a really, really interesting finding. But, you know, if people feel that there's insecurity within their jobs as well, if they're worried about whether they're going to be able to stay in their jobs, if the organisation's in difficulty, that's another factor. So it's all sorts of different things that play into a decision. And truthfully, it's rarely one thing as well. There's normally lots of different factors that come into play, including those non-work factors. So, you know, people might decide to relocate. Maybe their partner's job changes and that influences them too. Sometimes it might be because people's caring responsibilities changed. So sort of attitude to jobs, feelings about jobs are really only part of a very complicated story. But what really happens? What is the process that happens when people think I'm going to leave? And it's, you know, it's a fairly simple one. People become dissatisfied with their current job. Something happens, maybe one of those things that we've just looked at on the previous slide, or indeed something else. And they start to look at what else is out there. They maybe will look on some job boards, maybe they'll start having a bit of a look around on things like LinkedIn. And we start then to go through this comparison process. Does what else is out there look better than what I've got now on balance? And that is the sort of mental process that employees go through. So when we reach that point of disengagement, and we know that globally disengagement is a problem. Again, I think we estimate that around 80% of employees worldwide are either not fully engaged or actively disengaged. And that's a fairly consistent figure. That's got really nothing to do with the pandemic. But once we get to that disengagement point, that's the point at which we might start to look. And then when we do that balancing act, if the alternative looks better overall on balance, whether that's the development, the compensation, the culture, the manager, the opportunities, that's when the decision to leave really crystallizes. Now, what's interesting at the moment is that kind of second bullet point, that searching for opportunities. Well, if somebody's searching right now, there's a lot of them out there. Job vacancies are up. The job market is currently moving at pace. And I'm talking to lots of people who are saying, you know, great candidates are available 1 minute, you ring them up and they've gone, they've had an offer. So the market is really, really buoyant. And, you know, again, if we look at flexible jobs, which I'll talk more about in a moment, for those people who do want flexible work, those jobs advertised are up as well. So I saw some research, a survey from the Times only earlier this week that said currently 1 in 10 jobs in January was being offered with some element of remote work, and that is up. To put it into context, people are saying, you know, more jobs than ever. Actually, what's really happening is we're returning to pre-pandemic levels, but regardless, the market is quite buoyant. So if employers are going through this mental state right now, then they're in a good place because there are a lot of opportunities out there. But let me try and come now to this thing that I said earlier about people rethinking and going through this rethinking process. So, you know, we know what the last 2 years has been like, and I feel like I've been giving webinars in this spot for so long. And I started off by saying, we've been at home for 3 months now. We've been at home for 9 months now. It's been a year. And I don't think I ever got to the stage where I thought I'd be giving a webinar where I was saying it's almost 2 years since my employer sent us all home. And yet, you know, sort of here we are. And so much has changed. And there has been so much uncertainty. And a lot of our fundamental patterns and routines were broken. We've learned all these new habits, and regardless of what happens, regardless of whether the government say all the restrictions are gone now and you can return to your offices, many of us changed, and the workplaces themselves are also changed. And that's in really big macro ways and really small micro ways too. We have thousands of people in this country who have been bereaved. We have thousands of people who have been unwell themselves, perhaps seriously, or have seen people themselves, that they love, be also seriously unwell. We have potentially millions of people living with long COVID. And even for people who are not in those categories, so much has changed, and things we thought were certain are now much less so. So some of those things that we took for granted, being able to travel, being able to see people, and being able to go where we wanted, when we wanted, go to a restaurant, go to the gym, all of those things suddenly disappeared in a way that we might thought they never would. And we have kind of had to look at our own mortality. And that changes things, and it changes people's intentions about work. And I'm a coach, and one of the things we say a lot in coaching, I'm not sure who said it originally, but the presenting issue is not the real issue. And what we're seeing here is resignation. I see resignation as the presenting issue. It's what's happening, but actually what is underneath, what is driving that is a whole range of factors. And I'm going to explore one academic perspective on the next slide. But I think the one thing we have to recognise is that this is not over. People are still adjusting, they're still thinking. There are still disruptions in everyday life. Not everything is back to how it once was, if indeed it ever will be. And people are still settling, and their future intentions are also still settling. If we look at the process of change, there is a model called the trans-theoretical model of change, which talks about the many stages that we go through mentally when we're contemplating a change. And there's quite a lot that happens up front before we take action. So we have pre-contemplation, kind of thinking about it a little bit, contemplation, and then preparation. So in a job search sense, that might be getting the CV ready, doing a bit of networking, boosting that LinkedIn profile, maybe finishing off that qualification we've been trying to get around to for a couple of years. People might be preparing while they're thinking and while all this settling is going on. So I think at the moment, we have only seen the people that have taken action, but more turnover may yet come. So I said I just wanted to explore this one academic perspective, and I'm drawing on a paper here called The Intrapersonal and Intrapersonal Effects of Crucial Experiences. Unfortunately, it's behind an academic paywall, so I can't point you to the exact document, but if I can try and sum it up as best as I can, the authors propose that we sometimes will live through these kind of crucial experiences, really big life-changing stuff. So that could be bereavement, it could be divorce, it could be marriage, it could be having children, these kind of big things that happen to us. It might even be things like unemployment. And when these big things come along, and I am, as you can probably tell, clearly putting the pandemic in this bucket, when these big things come along, they can shake us really fundamentally, and they test the way that we relate to the world. And after we've lived through these things, we kind of have to have, some new meaning. We have to make some new meaning. And what I'm saying is essentially this kind of period of change, this period of uncertainty, is a normal response to a traumatic period. So when we go through these traumatic periods, they can be associated with like higher levels of reflection on one's own motivation, and a kind of increased orientation towards kind of what we call intrinsic motives. And they can have a bit of a turning point in our beliefs. So you can see on the slide there, I talk about them having this disconfirming function. So what that means is these crucial experiences often make us challenge things that we previously believed to be true. So it's really important to work long hours. I have to commute. I have to work full time, etc. Some of these are the things I'm talking about that when we live through a complex situation, a potentially traumatic situation, we often have this kind of turning point, heightened self-awareness, more reflection about our motives and the motives of others. So extrinsic motivation is doing stuff for reward, doing stuff for pay, maybe also like bonuses, that kind of thing. It's stuff that comes from the outside. The intrinsic motivation is the stuff that comes from the inside. So what I'm trying to say here in summarising this academic paper is when we live through difficult stuff, it makes us rethink at a really fundamental level. And some of that stuff it makes us rethink is it can help us reject what we once believed to be true. And it can make those external, extrinsic things less important, and internal, intrinsic things like purpose, meaning, family, all of those things become more important. And I genuinely believe this is a lot of what's going on here when we see this, when we see people saying, I want to work from home more. Again, that's the presenting issue. Underneath that is people saying, I want to spend more time with my family. I want to spend less time on a pointless commute. I want more time for exercise or what matters. Or when we look at, I want to leave, I want a job that has more purpose. I want a job that has more meaning, or I want a job that's going to allow me to do some of those things that my current job will not. So we've got this really complex, potentially perfect storm of post-pandemic issues. So I've talked about what makes people leave an organisation. What I want to talk about for a moment is what makes people stay. And when we say what makes people leave, that's a really common question in organisations. We do exit interviews, for example. In my experience, we don't often do much with the data, unfortunately, or make real big changes because of it. But not a lot of organisations put as much thought into why do people stay. Although over the last few years, we've seen a rise of this idea of something called like a stay interview, where organisations will actually do that. They'll talk to people and say, what makes you stay here? So they can really understand that. But there's a really interesting idea around what we call job embeddedness. So this is the extent to which somebody is kind of embedded in their job or their organisation. It's what kind of makes an organisation sticky to an individual. And then it looks at why are people committed to their job. So it's different to thinking about how do we increase employee engagement or employee satisfaction. It's thinking about what really makes people stay. So as we've seen, we normally think about turnover as being linked to job satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And when those things are high, people want to leave. But job embeddedness, the theory of job embeddedness tells us that that's kind of only partly true. And there are other reasons why people stay. And this theory sort of fits it around three things. You can see them on the screen there: links, fit, and sacrifice. And if I can take a moment or two to explain those. So links are the connections we have with other people in the workplace generally. So it's an issue which we've already touched on. So the more links people have with the organisation and the work, the more likely they are to be bound to it and to want to stay. Fit is about how well on an individual level the working environment and the culture suit the individual. So the greater the fit, the closer they will feel, the more likely they are to stay. Sacrifice is about how easily some of those links can be broken. So when people feel they would have to give up a lot to leave, they're more likely to stay. So that giving up isn't necessarily just things like pay. It might be job security, it may be a great pension, it may be great friends. But the more people feel they're going to have to give up if they leave, the more likely they are to stay. So people can become embedded into their organisations in lots of different ways. But I think that's a really interesting way of thinking, because it enables us to move that thinking forward and say, well, what are some of the things that we can actually do, which I'll come on to in a moment, that align to these things. We also know the importance of purpose and meaning, and I've got purpose on that slide there for sort of two reasons, because that third bullet point, autonomy, mastery, purpose, comes from the work of Dan Pink, which is a book I've already mentioned, and highly recommend to anybody who wants to know more about what motivates people in the workplace. But this idea of having control over how we work and when we work, which is very much linked to these ideas of flexible and remote working as well. Mastery, the ability to be able to develop, and purpose, having connection to something that the individual feels is important. So again, back to the idea of meaning. I'm doing something that means something to me, to others, in the world. And these are the things that connect people strongly to organisations. So some of you are seeing turnover, some of you are not, but what are the things that you can do to understand your kind of great resignation risk? Well, first of all, we can start with the data. We can start with looking at who is going, where are they going, and what are they telling you? So if you do exit interviews, what are they telling you about why they are leaving? So it's really important to understand those causes of turnover at the deepest possible level. And exit interviews can be part of that. As we've already seen, they can help with that kind of first bullet point, but so is this idea of a stay interview. So the stay interview is the opposite to an exit interview. It's ideally an informal conversation between the employee and their manager, in which you would explore what people like about the job, what motivates them, and why they choose to stay working for you and your organisation. And that can help give you some really valuable insight to what makes your organisation sticky, and can help you understand those things perhaps to maximise in a retention strategy. But trying as much as you can to understand what your causes are. Is it pay? Is it that you're not paying enough? Is it there's no development opportunities? Is it that people are unhappy with your culture, the amount they've been asked to come back to the office, etc.? You know, we need to understand why people are leaving now, and we need to understand why they're not. Because there is clearly a link between how engaged people are and the extent to which they will stay in their organisation, it's another really important area. And this particular slide I've taken by some research that came out, I think it was 2019, it will tell me on the slide, from Ashridge Education Centre. And that really focuses on the extent to which people within organisations are engaged. Of course, the more engaged they are, the more likely they are to stay. Now, actually, I'm not going to labour on this too much today in this presentation because I want to leave some time for questions. But if you actually go on to Google and Google this particular research, you will find that there is a really handy tool, free tool, that you can actually assess how engaged you think your current teams are. So it's worth a little look at this. Really interesting report. It's open access. So if you just Google shades of grey engagement in work teams, that should take you straight to it. And I think it's very much worth organisations thinking right now, how engaged are our people currently? Are they in that zone of engagement where teams are working together? Or are they actually in that bottom left-hand quadrant where there's a blame culture, there's gossip, managers aren't respected? Clearly, we want people to be as engaged as we possibly can be. So definitely worth thinking about, you know, how engaged do you think your people are at the moment? If you've got the opportunity, do a survey. If you haven't, do think about just having a look for this free online tool from Ashridge Education Centre. As I say, Google search should take you straight to it. But let me try and bring this all to a bit of a conclusion about what can you actually do as an organisation to retain your people. Well, we've looked at a few of these things. We've looked at obviously the importance of employee engagement and assessing that. But, you know, we do need to take potentially at this time some really deliberate action, as, you know, as given this changing context, given these kind of ongoing challenges and all this complexity of feelings related to the pandemic itself. So first of all, benefits still matter, of course they do, but money alone isn't always enough for people. People who are obviously engaged are less prone to a move. But, you know, if there is a disconnect between what people want as a benefit and what a company is offering, then, you know, that's obviously something to think about and to tackle. So it's always a good idea to ask employees what they want from their benefits package. we do tend sometimes, I think, as organisations to go for what's like easy or cheap. You know, like we'll pop in a discount platform because that's really easy to administer, but it's not always what people want and they don't use them. So it's worth looking at that. You know, what would your employees really value from a benefits package? Because the benefits you provide says a lot about you as an employer. And if you go back to that idea of job embeddedness, if you've got benefits that people really value, it's a sacrifice. It's something that they're going to have to give up to go somewhere else. So things like, again, back to this idea of people wanting to develop. You know, if you get the chance to do qualifications, that's a great way of keeping people with you. If you offer things like sabbaticals or the opportunity to work anywhere or work flexibly, some of those things don't cost huge sums of money, but can really help people feel rewarded and recognised, and they maximise those ideas of job embeddedness. The other thing around job embeddedness, if you remember, we talked about these ideas of weakened ties and the importance of social links. So lots of people have returned to offices, but certainly not in any level that we did before the pandemic. So getting people together, reconnecting them, providing space where people feel it's safe to meet, to spend time together, to reconnect, putting a bit of that kind of fun back in. And I don't mean an online Zoom quiz, I mean letting people get together and spending just maybe a little bit of money on that to re-establish some of those bonds and those ties that have lessened during the last 2 years. I think there's also a need for organisations to act quickly if they want to retain working parents and other people with caregiving responsibilities. Because a lot of those people are tired and burnt out, and the last couple of years has been tough. It has for everybody, but there's been some real particular challenges there. So definitely thinking about flexibility, and that's not just location flexibility and saying you can work from home occasionally, but also time flexibility. So allowing people to not just work 9 to 5 and requiring them to spend all day on a Zoom, but have genuine autonomy to say, you know, it's the middle of the day, I'm going to the gym, I'm going to go out and do something for my well-being, and I'll come back and do a bit more work later. Those kinds of benefits cost you very little, but are hugely, hugely recognised. We've also touched on the fundamental importance of good management, and this is where providing learning and development, leadership development, for people managers at all levels in your organisation is absolutely critical, because as we've seen, it is a fundamental driver in people's decisions to stay or to go. And then finally, I think, you know, I'll talk about well-being, and we know that in all sorts of different ways the pandemic has had a negative impact upon people's well-being. We have got significantly more people experiencing poor mental health. As a result of the last few years, we've got people who have got long COVID, we've got people who may have other health conditions but haven't been able to perhaps have them treated because of backlogs in hospitals because of the pandemic. So I would always have argued that well-being was important and fundamental, but now more than ever, I think it's true to say that organisations need to be taking their well-being strategy seriously. And if they don't already have them, looking at things like employee assistance programs and specific support for people experiencing poor mental health. So I think, you know, as we can see, there's no simple answers to this. There's no one answer to this. It will be a mix of doing different things because this is a complicated issue. So retaining staff after the pandemic in the face of this great resignation and buoyant labour market will take a multifaceted approach. But I think just remember that employees are still very much in that kind of in-between state. They're still reflecting, they're still thinking about what they want their lives to be post-pandemic. And of course, that includes how they work, what they do, where they work and when they work. And there may be some people that we simply cannot retain right now, but with a supportive approach, with keeping a great relationship with them, they could just be an alumni for a future vacancy. Okay, well, that is the end of my presentation, slightly longer than the 30 minutes promised, I apologise, but I'll stop sharing my slides now, and hopefully Hannah's been keeping an eye on the questions, and if there's anything anybody would like to ask me, I'm more than happy to answer them if I can, or maybe point you to some other reading. Hannah.
Amazing, thank you so much, Gemma. First, I just want to apologise that I look a bit creepy with this sort of light coming through my windows. It's so sunny in Sheffield today, so I look like I'm a bit in the dark. We've had a few questions come in from the Q&A box. If anyone is typing them, we'll give you a few minutes to do that before we go into them. I do just want to point out in the chat, I have just posted links to Gemma's Twitter, LinkedIn. So if you do want to connect with Gemma, learn more about her, as well as get any future guidance from her, please do connect in with her. And I've also realised today you might be a small business manager, or small business owner. So myhrtoolkit's got a free guide called the Ultimate HR Guide for Small Businesses. So if you do need any support or want to learn how you can implement some of the features that Gemma said today, please do feel free to download that free guide. So whilst you're doing that, I shall look at the questions. So the first question we have, oh, this is an interesting one. Is in your experience, Gemma, is there one incentive that employees are looking for in companies to stay, or would you recommend a broader incentives to offer your employees?
I don't think there's any one thing, because people's needs will vary and their preferences, and we're all motivated by different things. So although I've talked about this kind of idea of autonomy, mastery, purpose, and they're quite core. Some people are more influenced by status, some more influenced by money, some more by development. So I think the answer is having a broad range of benefits available for people. You kind of have to pay enough to take money off the table. I think that's important, and that's where things like the living wage comes in, because otherwise you might find people are leaving for what might be a smaller sum of money in the scheme of things, and then once you add in the cost of recruiting and replacement and training, it would actually make more sense to pay something like the living wage. But if I was to say one benefit right now, it's thinking about that flexibility. And the more autonomy that you can give people, the more personal choice you can give them about how and when they work, the benefits you will reap from that. And if I can do another plug, over on your website, there's also a guide to implementing hybrid work, which is I can say is brilliant because I wrote it. So that's there as well.
Amazing. I'll get that link up in a second for anyone that's interested. I'll pop that in the chat. There's also a question here on, in order to retain my employees, do you have any suggestions for onboarding new staff in remote working situations, as I've just had a new employee?
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of a difficult one. So I'm a big fan of remote work, but one of the things I think is really important is building in as much in-person time in those really critical early weeks, because that's when you build the relationships that will sustain you. So I think where possible, whatever somebody's going to be doing later on, even if they're going to be hybrid, dial up the in-person element. And builds those connections really, really quickly. So giving people a mentor and a buddy. If you think you're in the office and you don't know what you're doing, and there's somebody there going, how do I work the printer? Where's the kitchen? All those little tiny things. That's probably a bad example because you know where your own kitchen is, right? But you don't want to email somebody that, or maybe go, can I have a Zoom call to ask you this really basic question? So actually setting somebody up with that responsibility that you can ask the little quick questions of, somebody that will check in with them every single day, getting a really quick meeting in the diary where they can meet all the team on Zoom and just do a bit of an intro. So those initial relationships are built, getting kind of a coffee meeting in with people in the team in that first week. And providing as much connection as you can to the organisational culture. So it's history, it's purpose, it's meaning, and setting them up with all the development that they need to do the job effectively. So that kind of mix of things will help to connect people really, really quickly.
Brilliant. No, that's great. There's a question here which I did not actually think about, but this person's got a really interesting question. They're asking, do you think that the Great Resignation is also a window opportunity for employers to force change, i.e. take advantage of the turbulence to shape the business for the future?
Well, I think, the truth is you want some turnover. All organisations want some turnover. It's not necessarily a bad thing. If you have turnover, you will inevitably recruit. You will have new people coming in with new ideas, of new perspectives. and can maybe challenge some of the old stuff. So I think an element of turnover is a really, really good thing. So we shouldn't see it all as negative. And as I say, sometimes it's about building a great relationship with somebody whose life has just shifted and changed. And maybe there'll be, you know, a great connection for the future, or a future employee, or something like that. So I think, yeah, absolutely, we can see this as an opportunity, as well as a potential problem. There are, of course, potentially costs, and that's the challenge. You know, when organisations have too much turnover, it can, from the cost of recruiting and lots of new people, particularly if it all happens at once, is a challenge. But some, definitely, it's a good thing.
No, that's great. Thank you, Gemma. And this question says, I'm a small business owner and interested in implementing hybrid working in order to retain my staff in the long term. Is there any management tools or ways you think that my small business can manage that effectively?
So there's lots of things. There's absolutely lots of things that small businesses can do. I mean, some of those things around like leadership development is so important. So thinking about, what is the current capacity of your existing leaders? How able are they to manage performance, get the best out of people? Do they understand things like motivation, and do they understand things like coaching? And by coaching, I don't necessarily mean in the most formal sense, but in that sense that they can help get the best out of people and get them to think for themselves and take responsibility. So I think, that is something that often gets neglected in smaller organisations, because what happens is we promote people perhaps because they're really good at their current job, or they've been with us a really long time, and we don't always have some of that structure around. So I think developing managers, and that doesn't have to cost huge sums of money. There's loads of really great courses out there. There's brilliant TED Talks that people can watch and read. Books, all sorts of things that people can do. So I think creating as much in that development space for managers to really understand their role and how to get out the best of people is so important. Sorry, went around the houses a bit there, but if you've got any more specific questions, drop me a note on LinkedIn.
No, that is absolutely fine. Yeah, it's very long-ended question, definitely. We also have a question that's sort of slightly off the topic of the Great Resignation, but you do have a lot of experience in this, Gemma. So if you do have any other questions related to the Great Resignation, do use the Q&A box before we wrap up today's session. But this question says, how many notice letters should I issue if I want to dismiss an employee? Could you provide this person with any general advice, Gemma?
It's a really complex area. So, there are multiple legal grounds that you can dismiss somebody on, and there is a process that applies to all of them. So I think to give a very generic answer at this point would be really dangerous. My advice would be that the best source of free advice on that is the ACAS website. So go over there. You need to understand what is that you have a legal ground of dismissal in the first place, and then there will be a whole, if it's redundancy, there's one process, if it's misconduct, there's something else. So take some advice, take some specific advice on that, because I think to give you a generic answer could be very risky.
No, that's great. Someone has just asked, do you have any examples of surveys of interviews? I will put some links in the chat. Someone's asked for an onboarding link. We've got a really good blog post that I'll pop in the chat. But I'll turn this into a question from Christine. Would you say that this is a good time to have employee surveys or interviews for small businesses, or do you think that is sort of counterproductive?
No, I think this is absolutely the right time. I think, if there's ever a time for listening, it's now. And whether that is a survey or whether you just get some people together over coffee, and people are going through a lot. And I think the more you can understand about your workforce, their future intentions and their needs, the better. So as I say, focus group surveys, you can ask people just 7 or 8 questions on a free survey tool. There's lots of different ones on the internet. So so yeah, definitely spend some time. And if you've got the time and the resources, you know, ask people some of those stay interview type questions as well. Again, if you go over and do a Google search, you'll find lots of articles on stay interviews with some suggested questions, and, you know, ask people what's making you stay here, and how can I encourage you to stay here in the longer term.
Great, thank you. And I think if this is the final question, if you do have any questions, make sure to pop them in the chat. But this question says, I'm a business owner and one of my line managers in my business has had a high staff turnover. How would you recommend I approach this person, or if I should make any actions?
So I'm assuming that means this person's got like a higher staff turnover than maybe the organisation itself.
I think so.
I think it could be a coincidence, you know, so we have to remember that could just be the situation. It could be that person is just, as people have got all sorts of personal reasons, but it does warrant further looking at, because what you could have is, you could have a problematic culture that's arisen just in one team, or you could have a problematic manager. So I think it's one of those things to do a bit of a deeper dive. Have you got any exit interview data? Do you know anything about why those people left or where they went? If it wasn't too long ago, there's nothing to stop you writing to them and saying, we're doing some interviews to staff who've left in the last 3 to 6 months, something like that. Will they send in a little questionnaire to you? And, you know, if you're going to do something like an employee survey, pay special attention to the results from that particular area. And if you identify there's a problem, I'll come back to that question around kind of leadership development. You know, talk to the manager if you need to, talk to them about their development needs. What are your own observations of that particular manager and their skill set?
Amazing. That's great. Thank you, Gemma. I have also just popped in for that person that we have our guide on how to reduce staff turnovers. We've got many guides, so I apologise for putting so many links in the chat. Brilliant. Someone has just said, any books or downloads that have been referred to in this webinar, can you please leave the links and the titles and names in the group chat? Of course, that's great. We will as well. We can link the broader one of how to manage HR as an SME in our email follow-up. So we will put those resources in the emails too. But brilliant. I think that those are all the questions that we have time for today. So I just want to say thank you very much to Gemma. I think on the behalf of everyone on this call, you've really given us clarity, and some of people in the chat have said thank you. It's great to know that we're doing the right thing and supporting our employees and what we can improve on. So on behalf of everyone today, thank you so much, Gemma. It's been a really useful webinar. I will finally just put links to Gemma's Twitter and LinkedIn. Apologise for the many links again. So if you do have any further questions you want to ask Gemma that you didn't have time to ask her today, do feel free. On behalf of Gemma, she said, get in contact with her and reach out. And we do as well have those resources that we'll link to you, including the webinar recording today, the slide, Gemma's slide that she went through, and some guides that we'll link to if anyone needs any further support today. So thank you very much. I hope everyone's day is as sunny as mine is here. Gemma, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope everyone has a fantastic day.
Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye. See you soon.